Okay, so what you read about for this week was a pretty hefty section of the textbook, um, where we're moving from thinking about phonemic awareness and letter understanding of letters and letter sounds into actual phonics and phonics instruction and the best way to teach children who are learning how to read. So first we need to discuss Aries phases of word recognition development, and this is just a way to help us think about this process that an individual goes through as they're learning how to read. The first phase is the pre-alphabetic phase. This is basically where students read words by memorizing visual features. So for example, think about the word bed. We know that that word is B-E-D, and we know that each of those letters represents a sound that when put together makes the word bed. A child who doesn't completely have that alphabetic principle understanding yet might recognize the word just by its visual cues. So one end is higher, um, both of the outside ends of the word are higher, the middle is shorter, so there's this visual picture of the word bed. That's just one example. They could recognize many words just by the shape of the words. This is where you'd also see students possibly guessing words based on the context of what's being talked about or what's being read. Moving into the partial alphabetic phase, this is where students recognize some of the letters of the alphabet and are able to use them together with context to begin remembering words by sight. So they're using some of their knowledge that they have of sounds and spellings and attempting to sound out these words and possibly use context, knowledge, and understanding to figure out the word despite the fact that they might not know all of the letter sound correspondences there yet. And they may or may not get the word correct. The full alphabetic phase is where readers actually possess an extensive working knowledge of the letter sound correspondences system, or what's called the graphophonemic system. At this point, they can use this knowledge and analyze the connections between letters and phonemes in words. This is where we see students beginning to decode unfamiliar words. So a word that maybe they've never heard before, but because they have this alphabetic principle, they can actually begin understanding or sounding out and understanding the connections and put a word into memory that's after it's analyzed, and that word will become a sight word. Now, 4, we're moving more into sight words and information by memory. So students will consolidate their knowledge of this letter sound correspondence, or the grapheme phoneme blends. And when I say grapheme, I am referring to a letter, and phoneme, of course, the smallest unit of sound. So these grapheme phoneme blends become larger units, and this is when students and us, we start seeing these patterns in words repeat, and that helps establish that into memory for us. So again, we're starting to develop more and more sight words. And by sight words, I just mean that it becomes automatic for us to recognize the word, or at least the syllable that includes this pattern that we've learned. And that takes us to the automatic phase, and this is proficient word reading. This is where we would all be. We look at a word, we typically don't have to sound it out unless it's completely unfamiliar to us, because we've built this memory of these words. So, moving into good phonics instruction, the first thing would be to make sure we are developing this understanding of the alphabetic principle. in our students. And we've talked about the alphabetic principle already a little bit, and we should all kind of have a grasp of what it is, but let's discuss it a little bit in more detail. It's composed of two parts, or it can be thought about as two parts. You have alphabetic understanding, which is this idea that letters represent sounds, and then what we call phonological recoding. And this is using these relationships that we know between letters and sounds to first retrieve the pronunciation of an unknown word or to be able to spell unknown words. And there is a great website that the University of Oregon has. I will put the link in the comments under this video, but it's with the Center on Teaching and Learning. University of Oregon is well known for their education and special education program there. And this website is called Big Ideas in Beginning Reading, and it really gets into this process of learning the alphabetic principle and understanding this. Good phonics instruction also incorporates phonemic awareness. So not only are we looking at letters, but we're also still working with this ability to blend and segment words into phonemes. Good phonics instruction also provides sufficient practice in reading words. So we talked about last time that when we are working with a student, helping them develop phonemic awareness, we always want to do it in the context of reading. So we always want to show them words when we're trying to help them hear the different sounds within a word. So this is very similar to that. We want to bring in words and talk about phonemic awareness and blend and segment also when we're teaching phonics instruction. Good phonics instruction leads to automatic word recognition. So words start becoming sight words. And an important point to make, good phonics instruction is one part of a comprehensive reading program. So a comprehensive reading program is going to include lots of different pieces. So when we're teaching reading, we're not just moving from one skill to another. It's not kind of a black and white. Remember, we talked about all of the gray areas. So there is lots of overlap in what we're teaching and how we're teaching. So other things that we need to be thinking about at this same time would be vocabulary, new vocabulary words, and teaching meaning versus just the alphabetic principle and the sounds of words. We need to be helping students to understand comprehension, or to actually comprehend what we're reading to them or what they're reading, so that they actually understand that print has meaning. So, a brief review of what it means to use systematic instruction. This applies to anything. This particular slide is not specific to reading. It's kind of an overview of systematic instruction. So we know that systematic typically involves some type of order. So we clearly think through the skills that we're going to teach and the optimal order for introducing this information to our students. We also make sure that we have taught the pre-skills before we present something that uses those skills, so a strategy. So the students are aware of these pre-skills before we would teach them the strategy or the new information. We're going to introduce high utility skills before less useful ones. So that just means, if we're thinking about reading, that means that the most common letters and letter sound correspondences and patterns that we see in words would make sense to teach those first. We're also going to separate information that could be easily confused. Think back to our letters that are visually and auditorily similar. We also will introduce new information at a realistic rate, and that is extremely important. And this is where special ed is great about individualizing instruction for students. So, what may be realistic for one student may not be for another, and we need to consider that when we're teaching. Of course, assessment as we go through, informal assessment as we go through and we're teaching, obviously helps us determine this rate. And we need to provide adequate practice and review for the information that we've taught. So how does this apply to phonics, scope, and sequence? Well, you probably were thinking about this as we were going through the previous slide. All of these things on this slide actually relate to what we just talked about. We're going to introduce a set of sounds and spellings that occur most commonly in words. So you can think of some of the sounds that you hear most commonly versus those that don't. The letter T is something that comes to mind, and S. If you think about Wheel of Fortune, for example, what are those few letters that they automatically give at the end there that are, I think it's R, S, T, L, N, and E, maybe? So those are common letters. You're going to introduce high utility sounds and spellings earlier in the sequence. So, for example, we can use the letter M and the sound that goes along with it earlier on, as well as the short A sound, I, before we're teaching J, Y, K, J, Y, X, and Z, because we can use the M and the A more often than we would the latter. We're going to also think about progressing from simple to complex. So we're going to teach single consonants and short vowels before we get into digraphs. We're also going to make sure that we introduce some short vowel sounds earlier on. And if we stop and think about that, I think you'll understand why. We need to be able to make words, and consonant, vowel, consonant words are the simplest type of words that we'll use to teach reading to our students. And we have to have a vowel in order to teach those words. Letters with easy to pronounce sounds would come first. So it's easier for us to pronounce, or a child specifically, to pronounce continuous sounds than it is stop sounds. So comparing the M, and S to stop sounds such as B, B, and D, and other stop sounds such as that. That's not to say that we would not include stop sounds and that we would teach all of the continuous sounds first. That just means that we need to be thinking about this as we're choosing our sequence of letters. Obviously, there are several common letters that use stop sounds. But think about a word. If you're blending a word, it's a lot easier for you to say that stop sound at the end of the word versus the beginning. So think of the word mat, and bat. If we're segmenting that, mat, at, it blends with that short A very easily. If we're thinking about bat, the b, at, when we break that apart, there's that pause there. It's more difficult to blend. But when both of those words, the T, which is a stop sound, is at the end, so it's not quite as difficult for us to blend at the end of the word. Okay, this video we're going to stop. I have some additional slides, and that they will become part of a second video, and they will involve some action on your part. So get ready to play a little game.